The Velrith Interstellar Menagerie floated in the darkness of space like a jewel made of glass and light. It was the size of a small moon, and inside its walls lived creatures from 40,000 different worlds. Tourists came from every corner of the galaxy to walk its gleaming corridors and stare at beings they had only heard about in stories. It was beautiful. It was famous. It was a prison. Director Kaveth stood before the great window of his office and watched the stars. He was a crystalline, a being made of living gemstone that caught the light and scattered it into rainbows. He had run the menagerie for 300 years, and in all that time, he had never failed to acquire a specimen he wanted. His collection was complete, perfect, and utterly magnificent. Almost complete. There was one species missing. One creature that has escaped his grasp for decades. The humans. Humans came from a world called Earth, a planet so dangerous that the Galactic Council had placed it under quarantine. The gravity was crushing. The weather was violent. The other animals were predators with sharp teeth and terrible claws. And somehow, impossibly, the humans had survived it all. They had climbed to the top of their food chain, built cities, created technology, and finally reached for the stars. Kaveth wanted one. He wanted to study it, display it, own it. But humans were protected by treaties and laws, and the simple fact that they were very hard to catch. Until today, the message had arrived an hour ago. His acquisition team had found a human vessel drifting in neutral space, its engines damaged by an asteroid strike. There was only one survivor aboard. A male. Young and healthy and perfect for display. They had rescued him, of course. That was the official story. They had saved his life and brought him somewhere safe. The fact that somewhere safe happened to be a cage in the galaxy's largest zoo was simply a fortunate coincidence. Kaveth smiled, and light danced across his crystal face. The human arrived 3 days later. His name was Marcus Cole. He was 32 years old, with dark skin, short black hair, and brown eyes that held a strange kind of fire. He woke up in an enclosure designed to look exactly like Earth. There were trees and grass and a small stream that bubbled over smooth stones. The sky above was a perfect simulation of a blue Earth day, complete with white clouds that drifted slowly past. It was beautiful, and it was fake, and Marcus knew it immediately. He stood up slowly, his head still fuzzy from whatever drugs they had used to keep him asleep. His uniform was gone, replaced by simple clothes that felt soft against his skin. He turned in a circle, taking in his new home, and then he saw the barrier. It was invisible, made of energy rather than glass, but he could feel it when he reached out his hand. A slight pressure, a gentle resistance, and then nothing. He could not pass through. Beyond the barrier, he could see a wide corridor made of white stone. And in that corridor, he could see them. The Watchers. Dozens of alien beings, all different shapes and sizes and colors, all staring at him with wide, curious eyes. Marcus understood then. He understood everything. He was not a guest. He was not a patient. He was an exhibit. For the first 3 days, Marcus raged. He screamed at the tourists who gathered to watch him. He pounded his fists against the invisible barrier until his hands bled. He refused to eat the food that appeared in his enclosure, even though it smelled like home. He demanded to speak to someone in charge, to contact his government, to be released. No one answered. No one cared. The tourists simply watched him with the same mild interest they might show any animal in a cage. Some of them even seemed pleased by his anger. It was entertaining, they said to each other. The human was so lively, so emotional, so wonderfully primitive. Kaveth watched the recordings each night and felt satisfied. The human was performing beautifully. Ticket sales had increased by 40% since his arrival. Researchers from across the galaxy were requesting access to study him. The human exhibit was already the most popular attraction in the menagerie. Everything was going according to plan. On the fourth day, Marcus stopped fighting. It happened suddenly. One moment he was shouting at a group of tourists, and the next he simply went quiet. He sat down on the grass near the edge of his enclosure and looked out at the corridor beyond. His face was calm, almost peaceful. The keepers noted this change with approval. They had seen it before in other specimens. The anger face, followed by the despair face, followed by acceptance. The human was adapting. Soon he would settle into his new life and become a docile, easy exhibit. They were wrong. Marcus had not given up. He had simply changed his approach. Fighting the barrier had accomplished nothing. Screaming at the tourists had accomplished nothing. He needed a new plan, and to make a plan, he needed to understand his situation. So he sat. And he watched. And he listened. He noticed that his enclosure was not alone. To his left, beyond another invisible barrier, was a different habitat. This one was filled with purple mist and strange glowing plants. And inside it, barely visible through the haze, was another creature. She was beautiful in a strange, alien way. Her body was humanoid but taller and thinner, with skin that shimmered like moonlight on water. Long tendrils grew from her head instead of hair, and they glowed with a soft, sad light. She spent most of her time pressed against the barrier that separated them, her large dark eyes fixed on nothing. Marcus watched her for hours. He noticed that she only moved when the tourists came, pulling back into the mist to hide from their stares. He noticed that her tendrils dimmed when the corridor lights went down for the night cycle. He noticed that she never made a sound. She was lonely, just like him. On the fifth day, Marcus stood up and walked to the barrier between their enclosures. He could not hear her, and she could not hear him. The barriers blocked all sound. But he could see her, and she could see him. So he started talking. He told her his name. He told her about Earth, about the blue oceans and green forests, and the way the sun felt on his skin. He told her about his family, his friends, the life he had left behind. He told her jokes that she could not hear and stories that she could not understand. It did not matter. He kept talking anyway, and slowly, so slowly that at first he thought he was imagining it. Her tendrils began to glow a little brighter. Her name was Yule, and she was a Theshan mind singer. Marcus learned this from a small information panel near his enclosure. The tourists could press a button and hear a recorded voice explain what each exhibit contained. The voice told him that Theshans were telepathic beings who could project emotions and thoughts directly into the minds of others. They were rare, dangerous, and highly valuable. This particular specimen had been captured as a juvenile 40 years ago. 40 years. She had been in this cage for 40 years. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. Anger, yes, but something else too. Something that felt like determination. He kept talking to her every day. He would sit by the barrier for hours, telling her stories about his life. He described the taste of his mother's cooking, the sound of rain on a rooftop, the feeling of sand between his toes. He knew she could not hear his words, but he hoped she could somehow feel that someone was there, that someone cared, and she could. Yule had spent so long alone that she had forgotten what connection felt like. The keepers had isolated her because her telepathic gift was considered dangerous. They feared that she might influence other specimens, might cause unrest or rebellion. So they kept her in her purple mist, surrounded by silence, until her mind grew quiet and her songs faded away. But humans were strange creatures. Their minds were loud, messy, full of emotion and color and noise. Yule could not read Marcus's thoughts through the barrier, but she could feel the shape of them. She could feel his loneliness, so much like her own. She could feel his anger at their captors, burning hot and bright. And underneath it all, she could feel something else. Hope. Stubborn, impossible, ridiculous hope. It made no sense. They were prisoners in cages, surrounded by advanced technology and alien guards. There was no escape. There was no rescue coming. And yet, this strange, small creature from a dangerous world refused to give up. Yule pressed herself against the barrier and watched him talk. She could not understand his words, but she understood his heart. And something inside her, something that had been sleeping for 40 years, began to wake up. 3 weeks after Marcus arrived, Yule remembered how to sing. It happened in the night cycle, when the corridor lights were dim and the tourists were gone. Marcus was asleep in his enclosure, dreaming of Earth, and Yule opened her mind and let her song flow out into the darkness. It was not a song made of sound. It was a song made of feeling, of emotion, of pure telepathic energy. It rippled outward from her enclosure like waves in a pond, passing through barriers and walls and floors. It touched every mind capable of hearing it, every creature in the menagerie with even the smallest telepathic sensitivity. The message was simple. It was not made of words, because Yule did not know the words that other species used. It was made of images and emotions woven together like threads in a tapestry. She showed them Marcus, the small, soft creature who sat by her barrier and talked to her for hours. The being who looked at her not as a specimen or a curiosity, but as a person. The human who carried hope in his heart like a flame that would not die. She showed them what he made her feel. Not loneliness anymore. Not despair. Something new. Something warm. And she asked them a question in the only way she knew how. Do you feel it too? Across the menagerie, creatures stirred in their enclosures. A massive beast called a Gorath lifted its enormous head and rumbled deep in its chest. A pack of predators called the Rithkai opened their eyes in the darkness and looked at each other with new understanding. Small scavengers called Skiddick chittered to each other in their maintenance tunnels, their tiny minds buzzing with something that felt almost like excitement. They felt it. They all felt it. Something was changing. Marcus noticed the difference the next morning. He could not explain how, but the menagerie felt different. The air seemed lighter. The creatures in the nearby enclosures seemed more alert, more present. When he walked to the barrier to begin his daily conversation with Yule, he found her waiting for him, her tendrils glowing brighter than he had ever seen. She pressed her hand against the barrier, and after a moment, Marcus pressed his hand against it too. They could not touch, but they could pretend. He smiled at her. She could not smile back, not the way humans did, but her tendrils pulsed with warm light, and he understood. The keepers noticed the changes too. Their instruments showed a decrease in stress hormones across multiple exhibits. Appetite had improved. Self-destructive behaviors, so common among long-term specimens, had almost disappeared. It was as if the entire menagerie had suddenly become healthier, happier. They could not understand why. Director Cavith reviewed the data with a frown on his crystal face. Something was wrong. Something was different. And all of the changes seemed to be centered around one enclosure, the human. He pulled up the observation recordings and began to watch. He saw Marcus talking to the empty air, hour after hour. He saw him pressing his hand against barriers, making strange gestures, looking at other specimens with soft eyes. He saw the other creatures responding, turning toward the human, moving closer to his enclosure. It made no sense. The human was doing nothing. He had no tools, no weapons, no technology. He was simply talking, watching, existing. And yet somehow, impossibly, he was affecting everything around him. Cavith did not understand. And what he did not understand, he feared. But he did nothing. Not yet. The human was still his most popular exhibit. The tourists loved him. The researchers were fascinated by him. And the changes in the other specimens, whatever their cause, seemed to be positive. So Cavith watched and waited. He told himself that everything was under control. He was wrong. In his enclosure, Marcus finished his conversation with Yule and sat down on the grass. He looked out at the corridor, at the other exhibits, at the endless stream of tourists who came to stare at creatures in cages. He thought about all the beings trapped here, all the lives stolen, all the years lost, and he began to make a plan. Marcus had no weapons. He had no army. He had no secret technology hidden in his clothes. What he had was time, patience, and a gift that humans had carried with them since the beginning of their history. The ability to make friends with anything. It started with the Skitic. The Skitic were small creatures, no bigger than rats, with 6 legs and large, clever eyes. They were not exhibits in the menagerie. They were pests. They lived in the maintenance tunnels and air vents, sneaking out at night to steal scraps of food from the enclosures. The keepers tried to catch them, poison them, drive them away, but the Skitic were too fast and too smart. They had lived in the menagerie for generations, invisible and ignored. Marcus noticed them on his second week. He saw their tiny faces peeking out from a vent near his enclosure, watching him eat his dinner. The keepers had given him too much food, as always, more than any human could eat in one sitting. So Marcus took a piece of bread and walked slowly to the vent. He placed the bread on the ground, then backed away and sat down. For a long time, nothing happened. The Skitic watched him with suspicious eyes. They had learned to fear the larger beings in the menagerie, the ones who shouted and threw things and tried to hurt them. But Marcus just sat there, quiet and patient, not moving at all. Finally, one brave Skitic crept out of the vent. It grabbed the bread in its small hands, looked at Marcus with something like surprise, and disappeared back into the darkness. The next night, Marcus left more food. And the night after that. Within a month, the Skitic would come to him without fear. They would sit on his shoulders, nestle in his lap, follow him around his enclosure like tiny 6-legged puppies. Marcus talked to them the same way he talked to Yule, telling them stories and jokes and secrets. They could not understand his words, but they understood his kindness. And kindness, Marcus had learned, was a language that every creature in the galaxy could speak. The keepers did not notice. Why would they? The Skitic were pests beneath their attention. They did not see the small creatures carrying messages through the maintenance tunnels, connecting Marcus to parts of the menagerie he could never reach. They did not see the network growing in the darkness. Next came the Goroth. The Goroth was the largest creature in the menagerie. It was the size of a building, with thick gray skin like stone and 4 massive legs that could crush metal. It lived in an enclosure on the far side of the pavilion, visible from Marcus's own cage. The keepers kept it sedated most of the time because it was considered dangerous. Violent, unpredictable. But Marcus watched it carefully, and he saw something different. He saw the way the Goroth pressed against its barrier when other creatures walked past. He saw the way its small eyes followed them, full of longing. He saw the way it rumbled low in its chest, a sound so deep that it was more feeling than hearing. Marcus had read about earth elephants once, back when he was a child. He learned that they lived in family groups, that they mourned their dead, that they could recognize friends they had not seen in decades. The Goroth reminded him of those elephants. It was not violent. It was lonely. So Marcus began a new routine. Every day, after his conversations with Yule, he would walk to the edge of his enclosure closest to the Goroth. He would sit down, make himself small and calm, and simply be present. He did not shout or wave or try to get the creature's attention. He just existed, peaceful and patient. At first, the Goroth ignored him. It stayed in the far corner of its enclosure, watching him with suspicious eyes. But Marcus kept coming back. Day after day, week after week. He learned to mimic the low rumbling sound it made, humming deep in his chest until he could feel the vibration in his bones. After 2 months, the Goroth began to respond. It would rumble back at him, a sound that shook the walls of the enclosure. It would move closer to its barrier when Marcus arrived, pressing its massive head against the invisible wall. The keepers were stunned when they realized they no longer needed to sedate it. The Goroth was calm now, peaceful, almost gentle. They did not understand what had changed, but the Goroth knew it had found a friend. The Rithkai were watching too. The Rithkai were pack hunters from a world of endless forests. They were tall and lean, with sharp teeth and sharper minds. The keepers had separated them into individual enclosures because they were afraid what the pack might do if they were allowed to stay together. But the Rithkai could still see each other, still communicate through looks and gestures and the subtle movements of their tails. They had a concept in their culture, a word that did not translate well into other languages. It meant something like the one who walks between, a leader who united different packs not through strength or fear, but through something rarer and more powerful. Trust. The Rithkai watched Marcus share his food with the Skidic. They watched him sit with the Goroth, patient and kind. They watched him talk to Yule through barriers that should have made connection impossible. And they began to believe. One night, the eldest Rithkai pressed its hand against its barrier and looked directly at Marcus. It made a gesture with its other hand, a motion that Marcus did not understand. But he raised his own hand and placed it against his barrier, mirroring the movement. The Rithkai showed its teeth. Not a threat, a smile. Director Cavith received the report at the end of Marcus's 3rd month in captivity. Specimen stress levels had dropped by 40% across the entire menagerie. Feeding rates had improved. Self-harm incidents had nearly ceased. Every measurement, every statistic, every data point showed the same impossible trend. And it was all connected to the human. Cavith stood before his window and stared at the stars. He had run this menagerie for 300 years. He had contained creatures that could bend light, read minds, survive in the vacuum of space. He had never lost control. But now, for the first time, he felt something cold creeping up his crystal spine. He was afraid. Director Cavith made his decision on a cold morning when the stars outside his window seemed darker than usual. The human had to go. It was not personal. Cavith did not hate Marcus, did not wish him harm. But the human was changing things, disrupting the careful balance that had kept the menagerie running smoothly for 3 centuries. The other specimens were becoming restless, unpredictable. They watched the human with eyes that held something Cavith had never seen before. Hope. They were beginning to hope. That could not be allowed. Cavith called a meeting with his most trusted staff. There were only 4 of them, beings who had worked at the menagerie for decades, who understood that sometimes difficult choices had to be made. He explained the situation calmly, professionally. The human was causing problems. The human needed to be removed, not released, of course. That would raise questions, attract attention. No, there would be an accident. A malfunction in the environmental systems of the human's enclosure. A tragic loss, deeply regretted. But these things happen sometimes. The galaxy was dangerous, and even the best technology could fail. The 4 staff members nodded their understanding. They did not like it, but they were loyal to Cavith, loyal to the menagerie. They would do what needed to be done. None of them noticed the small creature watching from the air vent above them. A Skidic, its large eyes taking in everything, its clever mind remembering every word. As soon as the meeting ended, the Skidic disappeared into the maintenance tunnels. It ran through the darkness, its 6 legs carrying it faster than any keeper could follow. It found the nearest access point to the central pavilion and squeezed through. emerging in a storage room near the main exhibit dot from there. It made its way to Marcus's enclosure. Marcus was sitting by his barrier when the skidic appeared. It chittered at him urgently, running back and forth, making gestures with its tiny hands. Marcus could not understand its words, but he understood its fear. Something was wrong. That night, when the lights dimmed and the tourists went away, Yule sang. Her song reached Marcus first, filling his mind with images and feelings. She showed him what the skidic had seen, what it had heard. The meeting, the decision, the plan to kill him. She showed him the timeline, translated from the skidic's frantic gestures. 3 days. He had 3 days to live. Marcus sat in the darkness of his enclosure and thought about dying. He had known from the beginning that this might happen. He was a prisoner in a cage, surrounded by beings who saw him as property. His life had never been in his own hands, but he was not afraid. Not for himself. He was afraid for his friends. Yule, who had finally remembered how to sing. The Gorath, who had finally found peace. The Rithkai, who had finally found something to believe in. The Skidic, who had finally found someone who saw them as more than pests. All of them would lose hope if he died. All of them would sink back into despair, that he could not let that happen. So instead of mourning, Marcus began to plan. The next 3 days were the busiest of his life. He barely slept, barely ate, spending every moment gathering information and sending messages through his network of friends. The Skidic carried his questions through the maintenance tunnels, returning with answers from every corner of the menagerie. Yule sang his plans to every telepathic mind that could hear her. The Rithkai watched and waited, ready to act when the time came, and the Gorath sang too, in its own way. Its deep rumbling calls were not random noise, as the keepers believed. They were a form of communication, carrying meaning through vibration and frequency. Marcus had spent months learning to understand that language, and now he used it. He asked the Gorath a question. A simple question, but one that would change everything. Can you shake the walls? The Gorath's answer rumbled through the floor, through the barriers, through the very bones of the menagerie. Yes. On the morning of the 3rd day, Kavath arrived at his office to find a message waiting for him. The environmental systems in the human's enclosure were ready. The accident would happen at midnight, when the menagerie was empty and there would be no witnesses. He felt a moment of regret, but pushed it aside. This was necessary. This was for the good of the menagerie. He did not know that the Skidic had already spread the word. He did not know that every creature in the menagerie was awake and watching, waiting for a signal. He did not know that his perfect prison was about to fall apart. At 11 o'clock that night, Kavath went to bed. He had done everything he could. The human would be dead by morning, and everything would return to normal. At 11:30, Marcus stood in the center of his enclosure and looked up at the fake sky above him. He thought about Earth. He thought about his mother, his father, his little sister who had cried when he left for space. He thought about the blue oceans and green forests and the way the sun felt on his skin. He might never see any of it again, but that was okay, because tonight he was going to set his friends free. At 11:45, the Skidic gathered in the maintenance tunnels. There were hundreds of them now, a small army of clever creatures carrying tiny packets of chemicals that Marcus had taught them to make from cleaning supplies. The chemicals were not dangerous. They were just incredibly, overwhelmingly smelly. At 11:50, the Gorath began to hum. Its voice was so deep that most beings could not hear it, but they could feel it, a vibration that ran through the floor and walls and ceiling, a vibration that, at exactly the right frequency, made the barrier generators shake and flicker. At 11:55, the Skidic released their chemicals. The smell spread through the ventilation system, triggering alarms in 12 different sections of the menagerie. Emergency lights flashed. Evacuation protocols activated. Keepers rushed to respond to what they thought was a catastrophic leak. And at midnight, when the environmental system in Marcus's enclosure was supposed to kill him, Yule sang her greatest song. It was a song of freedom, a song of hope, a song that told every creature in the menagerie that the moment had finally come. Follow the human, she sang. Follow him to freedom. Today, we weave together. And one by one, the barriers began to fall. The barriers did not shatter. They simply flickered once, twice, and then went dark. The Gorath's subsonic song had found the exact frequency that disrupted the generators. And the Skidic had chewed through just enough power cables to make the backup systems fail, for the first time in decades. Centuries for some of them. The creatures of the menagerie were free. Marcus stepped out of his enclosure and into the corridor. The emergency lights cast everything in red, making shadows dance on the walls. Alarms screamed in the distance, but here, in the main pavilion, there was only silence, and then the silence filled with movement. They came from every direction. Creatures of every size and shape and color, emerging from enclosures that had held them prisoner for longer than Marcus had been alive. Some walked on 2 legs, some on 4, some on 6 or 8 or more. Some flew through the air on wings of light. Some crawled along the walls like living shadows. They were beautiful and strange and terrifying, and they were all looking at Marcus. He should have been afraid. Any sane person would have been afraid, standing in the middle of a corridor filled with alien beings, many of whom could have killed him with a single thought or touch or glance. But Marcus felt no fear. He felt love. Yule reached him first. She flowed out of her purple mist like water, her tendrils glowing so bright that they lit up the corridor like a second sun. She wrapped her arms around him, and for the first time in 4 months, Marcus felt the touch of another being. She was warm. She was real. She was his friend. The Rithkai came next. The pack reunited for the first time in years. They surrounded Marcus in a protective circle. Their sharp teeth bared not at him, but at the world that had tried to keep them apart. The eldest placed its hand on Marcus's shoulder, a gesture of respect and trust. And then the floor began to shake. The Gorath was coming. The other creatures parted before it like water before a great ship. It moved slowly, carefully, aware of how easily it could crush the smaller beings around it. When it reached Marcus, it lowered its massive head until its small, gentle eyes were level with his face. Marcus reached out and placed his hand on the Gorath's snout. The creature rumbled, and Marcus felt the vibration run through his entire body. "Thank you," the rumble seemed to say. "Thank you for seeing me." "Come on," Marcus said, his voice steady despite everything. "We're not free yet." The Skidic had done their job well. They had mapped every corridor, every access point, every security system in the menagerie. They knew exactly where the docking bay was, where the ships were kept, where the emergency exits led. They had been invisible for so long that they knew secrets even the keepers had forgotten. Now they ran ahead of the group, their tiny bodies darting through the red-lit corridors. Leading the way of freedom. The keepers tried to stop them. Of course they did. Security teams rushed to intercept the escaped specimens, armed with stun weapons and containment devices. But they had trained to handle 1 creature at a time, maybe 2. They had not trained for this. They had not trained for a Gorath charging through their barricades like they were made of paper. They had not trained for Rithkai pack tactics, coordinated strikes that disarmed them before they could even raise their weapons. They had not trained for Yule's song, which reached into their minds and showed them exactly what they had done, exactly what they were fighting to preserve. Many of them simply dropped their weapons and stepped aside, unable to continue, and they had certainly not trained for a human leading the charge, this small, soft creature who walked at the front of the greatest prison break in galactic history with absolutely no fear in his eyes. Director Cavith watched it all from his office. He had cameras everywhere, displays that showed him every corridor, every enclosure, every corner of his perfect prison. He watched his security teams fall back. He watched his barriers stay dark. He watched 3 centuries of work crumble in a matter of minutes. And he watched the human Marcus walk through the menagerie like he owned it. He stopped to help smaller creatures who were struggling to keep up. He calmed larger ones who were overwhelmed by their sudden freedom. He touched them, talked to them, looked at them with those strange, warm eyes. And they followed him. All of them. Every single one. Cavith had studied thousands of species. He had collected beings from every corner of the galaxy. He thought he understood what made creatures dangerous. He had been wrong. The human was not dangerous because of his strength. He had no strength. A Reithkai child could have torn him apart. The human was not dangerous because of his intelligence. He had no special genius, no secret knowledge. He was just a man from a dangerous world, caught in a situation he should never have survived. But he had survived. And more than that, he had thrived. Because humans had something that Cavith had never understood. Something that all his centuries of study had never prepared him for. Humans loved. Freely, openly, without reservation. They formed bonds with anything and everything, from the smallest pest to the largest predator. They looked at creatures who should have been enemies and saw friends instead. And that love was contagious. The docking bay doors opened, and Marcus stepped out onto the metal platform beyond. Ships of every size and shape waited there. Vessels that had brought tourists and supplies and new specimens to the menagerie. Now they would carry the prisoners to freedom. The creatures flowed past him, spreading out among the ships, finding spaces to rest and hide and simply exist without walls around them. Yule stayed close to Marcus, her tendrils wrapped around his arm. The Reithkai took positions around the bay, watching for any last attempts to stop them. And the Gorath rumbled with something that sounded almost like joy. Marcus looked back at the menagerie one last time. He thought about all the years he had lost, the life that had been stolen from him. He thought about the tourists who had stared at him like an animal, the keepers who had fed him like a pet, the director who had tried to kill him like a problem to be solved. He should have felt angry. He should have felt bitter. But all he felt was tired and happy and free. "Let's go home," he said. The ships launched one by one, disappearing into the stars. The Galactic Council would spend months trying to figure out what had happened. They would call it the largest coordinated interspecies action in recorded history. They would write reports and hold hearings and debate what it all meant, and in the end, they would quietly add humans to the list of species that were forbidden from ever being held in the Vorath. Interstellar Menagerie, not because humans were too dangerous, because humans were too kind. And kindness, they had learned, was the most powerful force in the universe. Far away, on a small world in the outer territories, Marcus Cole stood in a field of alien grass and watched creatures from 100 different worlds learn what it meant to be free. The Gorath grazed in the distance, its rumbles carrying across the open land. The Reithkai hunted together, their pack finally whole. The Skittic built tunnels beneath the surface, making a home for themselves in the warmth of the soil. And Yule stood beside Marcus, her tendrils glowing with soft, happy light. She could speak now, in words as well as songs. She had learned human language over the long months of their journey, word by word, phrase by phrase. "Marcus," she said, her voice like music, "why did you help us? You could have escaped alone. You could have left us behind." Marcus smiled and looked out at the world they had built together. "Because you're my friends," he said simply. "And friends don't leave each other behind." Yule's tendrils pulsed with warmth. She did not fully understand humans, not yet. Perhaps she never would. But she understood this. There was a species in the galaxy that would walk into cages and walk out with an army. Not because they were strong, but because they refused to let anyone feel alone. And she was very, very glad that species was on her side.